All right, we are in Screwtape Letters, letter 22. So the patient has fallen in love, and we can assume that she is a very good girl because Screwtape hates her. We find out that she is a Christian, and some of the things that Screwtape says, I'm horrified what I find. Not only a Christian, but such a Christian. A vile, sneaking, simpering, demure, monosyllabic, mouse-like, watery, insignificant, virginal, bread and butter miss. The little brute, she makes me vomit. She stinks and scalds. So he hates her, right? Which means that she's got to be pretty awesome and that, she's a very good Christian person. He says in the old days, they would have had her in the arena, which is where they martyred the early Christians, right? So that's the only thing you could do with them. Put them to death because they're not helpful for the demons. They can't pollute them. Just a quick little side story. So this has kind of been developing throughout the letters, but Wormwood has ratted out on Screwtape and tried to get him in trouble for blasphemy in hell. So a few letters back, it talked about how, what Screwtape said would have been considered as blasphemous, that God actually loves humans. And so we kind of have this back and forth between them. We find out that Screwtape's obviously not pleased about this. And he encloses a booklet on the House of Correction for incompetent tempters. So we can find out that there are punishments in hell for demons who don't do a good job with their work. And then in this picture, we are going to talk a little bit about how, Screwtape becomes a centipede at the end, which is fun. Okay, so one of the major things that this letter talks about is a lot about God and how he really works. And so Screwtape's claim is that God is a hedonist at heart. A hedonist is someone who seeks pleasure. So he talks about how all of the temporary pain and suffering that God allows us to go through isn't the ultimate end. So it says all those fasts and vigils and stakes and crosses are only a facade, right? He wants to give us everlasting pleasure and joy in heaven. And I know that it's probably hard for us to think in terms of eternity, but really what we're going through, all the sufferings that we experience in life, even the most terrible things that happen, are temporary. And when we can think about this big picture that for the rest of eternity, we will have pleasure in heaven with no pain, with no suffering, reunited with all people that we love. It's a different, way of looking at it, a different view. He makes this analogy how the suffering is as foam on the seashore, out at sea, out in his sea, there is pleasure and more pleasure. So the pleasure for more is like the sea. So obviously foam on a seashore is a very small part of it compared to a sea of pleasure. He talks about, obviously, how there's no pleasures in hell, right? It says that they view the miserific vision, so that's a play on the fact that we call it the beatific vision of heaven, is the most beautiful thing we'll ever see, which is God himself. So the miserific vision would be the most miserable, terrifying thing you could see, which would be Satan himself, I suppose. It talks about how God he has a bourgeois mind, right? So which is very common, because he made the world so full of pleasures. There are so many things that humans can do without sinning: sleeping, washing, eating, drinking, making love, playing, praying, working, right? Obviously making love for people who are married. You can do it without sin. So that God made this beautiful world full of all these things that people can do without sinning. And the demons have to twist these pleasures in order to make them bad. But everything starts off as good. Screwtape is upset, right? He moves on to talk about how one of the bad things about him, the patient, being with this girl is that she'll be introduced to her family and friends. It talks about how the house themselves is full of this impenetrable mystery, this deadly odor, which would be deadly for demons, which means it's actually good. It says because it's full of disinterested love. And Screwtape thinks that there is something else, that they must be trying to use each other, but the truth is, like we talked about before, that the demons can't accept love. They can't understand that someone would be willing to give them themselves, seeking nothing in return. And it says it's similar to heaven. It says the regions where there's only life, and therefore all that is not music is silence. I want to draw a quick differentiation here. We're going to talk about noise in just a second. So when we talk about music, we talk about, this means the beauty that comes from melody and tune, and there is an order to music. We talked about Fourth Freedom, that there are rules that we follow to make music beautiful. So think about music that has been beautiful for a really long time. Classical music, we can think about just different types of music that we enjoy, but that has some beauty to it. And this is in opposition to noise. So noise would just be sounds for the sake of sounds, and not necessarily ordered together, not necessarily making a beautiful noise, but is just noise. And then the role of silence in life is important, and in heaven and on earth, silence isn't just a lack of noise, right? Silence is able to be still, right? And not just having no noise, a lack of noise, but being still in our hearts, being still in our minds, being able to tap into, a deepness of who we are and who God is, and being like real with ourselves. In that silence, we're able to see ourselves as we are and see ourselves as God sees us. This quote says, "Music and silence, how I detest them both." So now we're going to talk about how hell has been occupied by noise. So here he means noise, the grand dynamism, the audible expression of all that is exultant, ruthless, and virile. Noise which alone defends us from silly qualms, despairing scruples, and impossible desires. We will make the whole universe a noise in the end. The melodies and silences of heaven will be shouted down in the end. So the goal of the demons is to replace beautiful and ordered music with simply noise. And then at this point, it says the manuscript breaks off and is resumed in a different hand. So Screwtape becomes so infuriated, probably with Wormwood, with the situation, with the patient, with everything else, that he turns into a centipede. Right, it says transformation proceeds from within. It's a glorious manifestation of that life force which our Father would worship if he worshipped anything but himself. And so his secretary finishes the letter for him. So Screwtape is now in the form of a centipede, a giant centipede. So he's no longer able to write because centipedes don't have hands.